All right, we are going to get started. Good afternoon. Welcome to all board members, administrators, and business managers. Thank you for joining us for this month's Lunch and Learn. Before I introduce today's presenters, I want... All right, we are going to get started. Good afternoon. Hold on one second, guys. I'm getting some feedback. Administrators and business managers, thank you for joining us for this month's Lunch and Learn. Before I introduce today's presenters, I want... All right. Sorry about that, guys. I was getting some feedback on my device. All right. So before I introduce today's presenters, I want to thank our session sponsor, Construction Engineers. Their link and contact information is on the screen. We are grateful for their continued support to NDSBA. In today's session, we will be discussing Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration updates for schools and bus drivers. Our presenters, Paul Haugland and Brian Bunnis, will provide information on upcoming FMCS changes, including the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse, reasonable suspicion training, and entry-level driver training. Questions are encouraged and will benefit our discussion, so please ask away. To ask a question, either enter your question in the Q&A box or click the raise your hand button. When we are ready to take your question, we will call your name and unmute you so that you may ask your question. If you raised your hand, but during the discussion your question was answered, please click the raise your hand icon again to deselect. We won't be monitoring the chat closely, so please use the previous two options. We will be recording today's webinar and posting it to the NDSBA website under resources. And finally, just a reminder, you've all been muted. Now I'm going to hand it over to Brian and Paul. Thank you for joining us today, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right, so I can just hit my share screen here and...
Yes. Oh, I'm gonna, you got it? Okay, there you go.
Is it up?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so my name is Paul Haugland, and I'm the State Program Specialist with the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. And one of my responsibilities, or a couple of my responsibilities, are acting as the liaison between FMCSA and our state partners, and monitoring and overseeing certain programs that the state implements from a federal level to make sure that they're being carried out in accordance with the regulation and in accordance with the laws. So my presentation today is going to be on the entry-level driver training, and I just wanted to start out and say right now there's not a ton of resources that are available to the entry-level driver training. And one of those reasons is because the entry date got pushed back. And, as we get closer to that compliance date, there is going to be more information that's going to be available. So one of the things I would like to encourage all of you guys to do is go to that page and sign up to receive email notifications as more information becomes available on this topic. And I did include a link for the training provider registry on one of my slides. So it's really a pretty good source of information. Like I said, there's not a ton of it right now on that website, but as more information becomes available, it'll be posted at that particular website. So with that said, between Brian and I, we've got a lot to go over. So I'll just head right into the presentation here. So what I want to discuss with you guys today are, probably the highlights of the entry-level driver training as they are today. We're going to talk a little bit about the compliance date and who must comply. We're going to talk a little bit about the training provider registry. What exactly is that training provider registry? We're going to talk about the types of training that have to be provided, both the theory and behind the wheel training. We're going to talk a little bit about what a training provider must do once the training is completed. We're going to talk a little bit about what the licensing agency has to do once they've or before they can issue a CDL to an entry level driver, or even before they can test do a CDL skills test on an entry level driver, and then just talk a little bit about some resources that are available to you guys as well. So let's talk a little bit about the compliance date and who has to comply. So as many of you already know, the compliance date for the entry-level driver training was supposed to be February 7th of 2022. That did get pushed back to February 7th, or pardon me, it was supposed to be this year, February 7th, 2020, but it got pushed back to February 7th, 2022. Some of the reasons that got pushed back were IT issues on our part. Some of it was IT issues on the remainder of or a lot of the jurisdictions out there that issue commercial driver's licenses. So there were a whole host of reasons why the compliance date got pushed from 2020 to 2022. When it comes to who has to comply, it's pretty straightforward. We're looking at anybody that is looking at obtaining a new commercial driver's license with applicable endorsements, or if it's a current CDL holder and they're seeking to obtain a passenger or a school bus endorsement. Those are going to be the two categories of drivers for this particular purpose that are going to need to go through the entry-level driver training. So let's talk a little bit about the training provider registry. So let's talk a little bit about just what is it in general. So there's a few different things that the training provider registry is going to be able to do. The first thing is it's going to allow the training providers to go and register and certify that they've met all the requirements of the entry-level driver training rules, so that they can go ahead and train students. It's also going to be a website where CDL applicants can go and find qualified training providers. It's also going to allow training providers to submit those certifications to the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. And it's also going to allow the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration to transfer those training certifications to the states so that they can be checked prior to licensing and prior to administering a skills test on an entry-level driver. So right now, the training provider registry isn't up and going. The plan is that it's going to be up in summer of 2021. And so when it's up in summer of 2021, what that's going to allow is it's going to allow those training providers to go ahead and go to that website, certify that they meet all the criteria, that they're going to teach the curriculum that's outlined. And so that's what they're going to be able to do at that point. So then by February of 2022, that site's going to be active, and it's going to allow drivers to do the searches for the training providers. It's going to allow the training providers to push information to the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. And it's also going to allow the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration to go ahead and push that certification information to the driver's license authorities in each of the jurisdictions around the country. So when it comes to the training, there's two types of trainings that are outlined and have to be completed. The first one is theory training. So that training can be delivered in a variety of different ways. It can either be delivered in person by through lectures. It can be provided in person through demonstrations. It can be computer-based, it can be online, any number of ways it can be accomplished. There are no minimum number of hours for instruction. So however long it takes the class to get through the theory is however long it takes to get through that training. In this particular training session, or in this particular block of instruction for the entry-level driver training, every entry-level driver has to go and take a test. They have to score at least 80% on that test. And then those test scores then at that point are going to be transmitted to the FMCSA through the registry, and that's where we will maintain them. Some of the broad topics that are going to be included in the training are going to be, basic operations, safe operations, the different types of vehicle systems. Now, if you want a complete list of how the curriculum is laid out and the specific areas that have to be covered, you can always go to 49 CFR Part 380 and look at appendices A through F for the complete curriculum. Then we get to the behind the wheel portion of the training. And so the behind the wheel is broken up into two different types of training. One of them is going to be kind of in a controlled environment on what we call a range, where they're going to start, learning the basics of basic controls, safe operating of a commercial vehicle in kind of a closed session or in a closed environment. And they're gonna, work on certain types of backing and maneuvering skills of a commercial motor vehicle, and in this case, a school bus. And then once they've completed that, that range portion, and they can demonstrate that they can safely operate and control a commercial motor vehicle, at that point, that person can go out onto the public roads and get practice out there. Now, with the behind the wheel training, there are no minimum number of hours that a student is required to spend on behind the wheel training. Again, it's going to be dependent upon each individual. Now, it's important to note here, unlike with the theory training, drivers aren't required to take any type of a test. The training provider just simply certifies that a driver has met the requirements, and they'll just input the driver's name, their commercial driver's license number, and the date that the training was completed. And like I said, there is a piece that each driver's license agency is going to have to play in this, and that's before conducting any type of a skills test. The driver's license agency has to ensure that each applicant has completed the entry-level driver training. And again, these certifications are going to be pushed out to the states when a person comes in to apply. So they'll end up typing in, for instance, a driver's name and driver's license number to query if that person has been through training. And then we will push that information out to the states, and they'll be able to verify that particular driver has been through training or has not been through training. So that's really all I've got on the entry-level driver training. I know, as we kind of move into 2021 and closer to 2022, there's going to be a lot more information, and I'll probably expect to get some more phone calls, not only from the school bus industry, but just from the commercial motor vehicle industry in general. So I've listed the website up there for the training provider registry. Again, I would encourage all of you guys to go there and sign up with your email addresses to get any of the newest information. And as we move closer to 2021 and closer to 2022, that's where the agency is going to post any of its, webinars, trainings, PowerPoint presentations, and so forth. That's where they're going to be housed, is at that particular website. And then I have given you guys my phone number and my email address. So if you need additional information or want to talk about, specific issues that maybe, at your particular school district, feel free to give me a call or contact me by email. So if anybody has any questions, I can take questions at this point, or we can wait until towards the end of the presentation.
Paul, I'm not seeing any questions at this time. Oh, wait, I did receive one.
Okay.
Do FMCSA requirements apply to drivers who don't cross state lines?
This particular requirement, the entry-level driver training, is going to apply for the drivers, or apply to drivers even if they don't engage in interstate commerce. And the reason that this is going to apply is because commercial driver's licenses are a requirement for anybody that operates a vehicle that either weighs so much or transports so many passengers, and that's not dependent on whether you engage in interstate commerce or not. It is vehicle specific.
Looks like that's all I'm showing for questions at this time.
All right.
Okay. Are we sharing, Paul?
I can see it.
Yeah, I'm seeing it.
Excellent. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Brian Beness, and I'm a safety investigator here at the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. And this afternoon, we're going to be covering Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. I've got a lot of information to cover. We're probably going to go through it kind of quickly, but I wanted to get you as much information as we could on the clearinghouse. As Paul just mentioned with the last question, there's two areas of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations, Part 382 and Part 383, that you guys are required to comply with, and that's drug and alcohol testing and the commercial driver's license sections. For most of the other regulations, there's exemptions for school bus operations and government entities, and those are found in 390.3 F1 and F2. So most of the regulations you're exempt from, but the two areas again are the drug and alcohol testing and the CDL requirements, and those apply to both interstate and intrastate operations, as well as government agencies and political subdivisions also have to comply. So the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse, from what I understand, is that back in, I believe it was the end of September, Department of Public Instruction required all school districts to be registered in the clearinghouse, and we're getting a lot of calls on the clearinghouse and a lot of questions. What is the clearinghouse? What are we supposed to do in the clearinghouse? And hopefully we'll clear that up today. So first of all, I'll give you an overall overview of the clearinghouse. And the clearinghouse was mandated by Congress under the MAP 21. That was a highway reauthorization bill back in 2012. The rules for the clearinghouse were published on December 5th of 2016. That established the requirements for the clearinghouse with an implementation date of January 6th of 2020. And as you know, we're past this date, and this is one of the rules and regulations that did take place on the date that they said it was going to. So the clearinghouse went active back on January 6th of 2020. And the reason for the clearinghouse is it's a database containing CDL drivers' drug and alcohol program violations. These violations are reported by employers and medical review officers. And it also includes information whether that driver has successfully completed the return to duty process and is eligible to drive again. Prior to the clearinghouse, basically it was on your word. Information did not get shared from company to company. So you'd have a driver that would test positive at one company. He'd go to the next company. He wouldn't inform them that he worked at the prior company or tested positive. He tests negative at his new company and he's back on the road. Well, that's what the clearinghouse is designed to make sure that drivers who do test positive, they go through the complete process before they're allowed to drive again. And also keeping those drivers who don't go through the rehabilitation process to keep them from driving commercial motor vehicles. Clearinghouse, it keeps driver information secure. Only registered users can access the clearinghouse for the intended purpose. And information in the clearinghouse is not shared with other agencies such as state driver's license agencies and state law enforcement agencies. So like the North Dakota Highway Patrol, they do not have access to the clearinghouse, but they do have information on drivers. If they are prohibited from driving because of an alcohol violation, when they do a driver's license check on a commercial drivers through the commercial driver's license information system, it will let them know that the driver has an alcohol violation and is prohibited from operating. So again, the reason for the clearinghouse is to allow real-time access to reported violations for users. It's easier for employers to do the pre-employment investigation. It's more difficult for dishonest drivers to conceal drug and alcohol violations from their employers, and more insight to employer compliance with drug and alcohol rules. And what the goal is for safer roadways. Any questions to this point? Okay. Next, we're going to go into using the clearinghouse. So from what I understand, pretty much everybody's been registered so far, or should have been registered. So who's required to use the clearinghouse? Drivers who hold commercial driver's license permits or learner's permits, the employers of those drivers, consortia or third-party administrators. And consortia, that would be your drug and alcohol testing provider, your consortium. I assume you probably have your drivers are lumped in with other drivers from whether it be other school districts or other commercial drivers. And third-party administrators could be your drug and alcohol testing provider, or it could be somebody like a hiring agency. Medical review officers, those are the persons that review positive drug tests. Substance abuse professionals, that's the person that a positive driver or a driver who has refused a test would go see. He gives the driver his evaluation and recommends any treatment program. And then state driver's license agencies. And this is one section that's been delayed up until 2023, January 2023. Eventually, all state driver's license agencies are going to be tied into the clearinghouse. And if you have a driver that is tested positive that hasn't completed the rehabilitation process, they're going to be denied renewal of their driver's license when the time comes. So what action must users take in the clearinghouse to record drivers' drug and alcohol violations? Drivers are going to have to give consent for others to see that information on them. And then you're going to be conducting queries to determine if the clearinghouse contains any record of the driver that you're searching, if there's any information in the clearinghouse regarding a positive test or refuse to be tested. So employers and third-party administrators, you need to register in the clearinghouse if you haven't already. You can also invite assistance. You can have more than one person registered to use your account. You're going to have to request specific consent from the driver to conduct a full query, and we'll show you an example of that in a little bit. You're going to query all prospective employees and all current employees. So all new drivers are going to have a query conducted on them, and then all current employees, at least once a year, you're going to be doing a query on those drivers as well. And then also you're going to be reporting violations such as drug and alcohol program violations, return to duty testing, and then when they complete their follow-up testing criteria, you'll be reporting that as well. So as I mentioned, you can designate other persons to assist you, and that would be designating a third-party administrator. They must be registered in the system before you can designate them. And employers, as employers, you can select them to take actions on their behalf. So some of the things that a third-party administrator can do is they can report that return to duty test for you, and they can also report the follow-up testing, and they can do queries on your behalf as well. But this is a contract. This would be an agreement between you and the third-party administrator. For example, like Sanford, they're probably the largest third-party administrator in the region. You can make an agreement with them that they will do certain things on your behalf. But overall, you as the employer are still responsible to make sure that things get done. Here's just an example of some assistance. So this carrier, there's one person that has registered as the administrator in the clearinghouse, but then they also have three assistants that have also registered. So once you register as the administrator, you can also request assistance, and you would send them out the application. They would register as an assistant under you. So you can have more than one person in the school involved in this if that's what you wish. Here's an example of third-party administrators that have been designated. The first one there is 10th Street. That's a hiring company, and this carrier has designated them to do the queries. They don't want them to report violations or return to duty information. They just want them to conduct the queries. So I assume in this case, it probably would be the pre-employment query that would be conducted as part of the hiring process. The second one there, Concerta Medical Compliance Administration. This is a drug and alcohol testing provider. And this carrier, they want them to report violations and report to the return to duty information, but they don't want them conducting queries on their behalf. They want to do that on their own. And then the third one is just an example of Sanford Occupational Medicine. And this carrier wants them to report violations, report the return to duty information, and conduct queries. Even if you designate somebody to do this for you, you as the responsible party needs to make sure that it is getting done. And if you want them to do like pre-employment queries, you can still do the other queries on your own. Any questions up to this point? Okay, then we'll move on to queries and consent requests. Okay, so as an employer, we're going to be required to query the clearinghouse on two different occasions, and that's for pre-employment screening and the annual verification. So before you hire a driver, before you let the driver drive that school bus, you're going to have to do a pre-employment query to make sure that he's not prohibited from operating. And then once a year, you're going to be doing the annual verification. So the pre-employment query is going to be required, or pre-employment screening is going to be a full query. A full query, you're going to have access and full details on any violations that are listed in the clearinghouse. This would include the return to duty information as well. The annual verification can be a limited query. And the limited query, basically all this does is it'll let you know if there's any information in the system or not. If there's no information in the system, that's as far as it goes. If there's information in the system, then you'll have to go ahead and conduct a full query. So consent requests. The driver has to give you consent before you can search the database to see the information in the system. A limited query can be done on an annual check, and that's the only time a limited query can be done is on the annual check. And you can get a general consent request outside of the clearinghouse for this. Basically, you just have a form saying, I, Joe Smith, hereby allow the school district to conduct a limited query on an annual basis for the duration of my employment. You keep that form on file, and you can conduct limited queries on this driver for as long as he's employed with you. So once a year, you don't have to ask any more consent from him. You can just go ahead and do that limited query, and hopefully nothing comes back and the problem is taken care of. You've completed your obligation with that driver. Now, if the driver refuses consent, the query cannot be conducted, and then that driver has to be removed from safety sensitive functions. You cannot allow that driver to continue driving if he refuses to provide you consent. Now, if the driver provides consent, and if it's the paper version for a limited query, basically you just have to keep that on file. If if it's a full query, then it's going to be maintained in the clearinghouse, because the driver is going to go in, he's going to give that consent through the clearinghouse. Now, a full query, you can do a full query on, it's required for all pre-employment queries, but you can also do a full query on the annual query if you do choose to. Specific consent has to be provided electronically within the clearinghouse, and we'll show you an example where you send the request out, the driver clicks, yep, it's okay for you to get the request, and at that point, the query is conducted. Again, if consent is refused and the query cannot be conducted, then the driver has to be removed from a safety sensitive function. He is no longer allowed to drive until he grants consent and the query can be conducted. So if the consent is provided, you conduct the query. It's going to give you, on a full query, it's going to give you the details of what happened to the driver. Did he test positive? Did he refuse? Where is he at in the process? And we'll show you some examples of some results here in just a couple slides. Now, there is a charge for conducting a query, and that's $1.25 for each query. And there are payment options, and it's through pay.gov, which is an IRS website or IRS site that processes your payments. You can do electric fund transfer, credit card, debit card. You can also PayPal and Amazon Pay are also accepted. And on your statement, it's going to appear as DNA Clearinghouse when you get your credit card statement. There's an unlimited plan, and that's $24.5, and that's works out to 19,000 queries, which is a lot. So only some of the larger carriers in the country are going to be using that. But the $1.25 individual plan, you can buy as many as you want at any time, and they don't expire. There's no expiration for them. If you buy 100 queries and it takes you 3 years to use them, they're still good. If you buy 10 queries and decide you need to have an additional 10, you can always buy more at any time. When you log into your, when you access the clearinghouse through entering your username and password, you will see the query plan summary. It'll tell you the number of queries that have been conducted, the number of queries that are pending, and your balance as far as the number of queries you have available to you that you've paid for. And also there's going to be a transaction history listed as well, showing the queries that you purchased and that the date and when it was paid for. So how do you query driver information? So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to enter the driver's name, date of birth, and CDL number, and the state and county of issuance. So you enter this information, and it's going to verify that driver information. It's going to check with the clearinghouse database and also with the state driver's license to make sure that's a valid driver's license number. So once you verify that information, you have 2 attempts to make sure that it's correct. Once you verify it, then it's going to give you the option of what type of query you want to do. Do you want to do a limited query, or do you want to do a full query? Now, the limited query, a pop-up box is going to come up, And it's going to say, I certify that I have obtained the driver's general consent to a limited query in the clearinghouse, and that this limited query falls within the time frame specified in the grant. So that's basically, you're going to verify that, certify that yes, you do have a written consent on file for that limited query. The second query, the full query, you're going to have to get the driver's consent through the clearinghouse, and I'll show you that in the next slide. But a pop-up box pops up there and says, is this query being conducted as part of a pre-employment screening? If you check yes on this box, it's being done as part of a pre-employment screening. If any information comes into the clearinghouse within 30 days of doing your check, it will notify you. So if a driver has a violation that hasn't been entered into the clearinghouse when you do your pre-employment query, FMCSA will notify you within 30 days of doing your pre-employment query that there's some information in the clearinghouse on this driver. Here's just a sample of a written consent authorization for a limited query, and you can find a sample of this on the website. So the next step would be to conduct the query. And you can click conduct query, and this is an example of a limited query. And what you want is on the left there, the query is complete, result, driver is not prohibited with a nice green checkbox there. This driver, you've conducted your limited query, and he's good to go for the next year. On the right side, where you see the query is complete, you get a little warning triangle, and it says results found, that there's information in the system and that a full query is needed. Send consent request for the driver for the full query. So you'd want to send that consent request, and the driver is going to have to go in and give you consent. Now, if you do a limited query and it results in a full query, you're only going to be charged once for one query. You only be charged that $1.25. So the next thing will be you send the driver consent request, and it'll let you know that the consent request has been sent to the driver. And this is what the driver will see then. The driver goes in, he logs in, and he's going to either grant you authorization, he's going to grant you consent, or he's going to deny you consent. It also tells him if there's violations in the clearinghouse on him. So if he grants you consent, the query is going to take place and you'll get the results back right away. If he does not grant you consent, if it's a new employee or a current employee, that driver is not able to drive at that point. He's got to be removed from safety sensitive functions. So this is an example of results of a full query. It's going to give you the details on the information. This example comes back as a positive drug test or a positive alcohol test, and came back 0.04 or greater. I've got some better screenshots of some actual queries that were done here. And it's going to also give you the violation history, the return to duty status, the employment status. I'll show you some examples here. You can also do bulk uploads if you want to do multiple drivers at one time. There's a TSV spreadsheet that you can download, and you can submit a bulk upload. You can do multiple drivers at one time. So here's an example of a pre-employment query or an employment query that came back, and this driver is not prohibited. It's going to give you the driver's information, and there's no violations. This driver does not have any violations in the system. So the next one here, you'll see that this driver comes back, driver prohibited. And this was a positive drug test. The test was conducted on 8/31 of 2020. The result was verified by that MRO on 9/8 of 2020. And this was a pre-employment drug test that the driver tested positive on. That's going to give us the violation information as well. It was a positive drug test on a pre-employment, and this was for methamphetamine or amphetamine. So this driver tested positive for meth. And this result was reported by Global Safety Network. This is one of the consortiums out of Grand Forks that reported this one. So this driver, he's not going to be able to drive until he starts the rehabilitation process. Here's another example of a driver that was prohibited, but we'll see this one, his status is eligible for return to duty testing. So this driver has went and seen the substance abuse professional on 9/4. He designated as SAP on 9/4 as well. The initial assessment was done on 9/7 of 2020. And whatever treatment and rehabilitation process the substance abuse professional gave this driver, he completed it on 10/5 of 2020. But he does not have a return to duty test yet. So if you were looking at hiring this driver rather than a pre-employment drug test, you would have the driver take a return to duty drug test, which would suffice as the pre-employment drug test as well. And the difference between a return to duty test and a pre-employment test is the return to duty test is an observed test. Somebody has to be observing you take the test when you do that. And if this driver takes that return to duty test and it comes back negative, he would be authorized to drive then. He would be able to drive, and the only thing that he'd have left would be the follow-up testing. At a minimum, 6 follow-up tests throughout the next 12 months have to be completed. Further information on this one, this driver, it was a pre-employment test and he tested positive for marijuana. Any questions about conducting queries?
Brian, we do have a couple in the Q&A.
Okay.
So the first one is, so if we use Sanford Ahmed, we should still make sure we are registered and we have Sanford. If we wish, do the query, return to work and consent request and violation listing?
Okay, guess I'm not quite following, but yes, you want to make sure that you have to be registered in the clearinghouse. The third parties, they can do actions for you, but again, it doesn't relieve you of that responsibility. And you want to make sure that they are doing what they're supposed to be doing for you. They cannot purchase query plans for you. That has to be done on your own. But then once you do, if you want them to do queries for you, for example, the pre-employment query, they can do those, but they'd be drawing off of your bank of queries that you've purchased.
Okay, do bus drivers have to register themselves in the system, or are they automatically in the system if they have their CDL?
Good question. They would have to register themselves, okay? All drivers are not required to be registered. If you've got a driver that's been employed with you for many years, he or she does not have to register because you can do that limited query on them, and they don't have to go into the clearinghouse to grant you authorization to do a query. But all new drivers or any driver that comes back that there's information in the system, they have to be registered within the system. And they would go to clearinghouse.fmcsa.dot.gov to register. And they would have to be registered. And if they're ever looking at, applying for other jobs or maybe applying for a summer job driving, they'd have to be registered in the clearinghouse as well.
Okay, next question. How do drivers get into the clearinghouse to give you permission?
They have a login just like you do. So when you send a request out, when they go in and create their account, they can list their email address. I believe they can also get texts, which will also notify them that, hey, somebody wants to run a query on me, and then they would log in and grant that authorization. And they can go in at any time and view any information on themselves if there is any in there.
Okay, a few more questions. How does the driver log in into the clearinghouse to, how does the driver log in into the clearinghouse to give permission?
Yeah, they'd have a login, just like you would as a employer, except it's just a different site. They log in as an employee in the clearinghouse, and then they have access to their information.
Is the query cost per driver or per query?
It's per query. And like I said before, if you have a limited query that turns into a full query, as long as it's done right away, they're only going to charge you once for that.
Okay. Let's see. So if they are drivers we already have hired, only require a limited query unless something would turn up?
That is correct. So if they're your current drivers, they've been employed with you for years, you can do a limited query on them, and the only time they would have to register or that you would have to do a full query is if there's some information that got put in the system on that driver.
Last question. So if we have had some drivers for many years, do we ask each driver to create a login?
You can, but they don't have to. Again, if they don't have to register in the clearinghouse, if you're going to do a limited query. Now, if you're going to do a full query on them, then they would have to register in the clearinghouse before you could do that full query, because that's how they grant consent.
When do we need to start doing the annual query?
Good question. So the clearinghouse went into effect on January 6th of 2020. So prior to January 26th of 2021, you should do an annual query. I would probably recommend, based on the type of business that you're in, is probably every August. You're going to be hiring new drivers. You got your old drivers coming back. That would be a perfect time to run all the queries. You run your new drivers, pre-employments, you do the current drivers, annuals, and every year before school, run the checks on them, so you don't have to be running them throughout the year.
I do have one last question, but I think it's for Paul. It's regarding entry level.
Okay.
I'll read it. We purchased a training program from Safe Schools that claims to cover all training for entry level. Is there a way to verify this program meets the requirements? Paul, can you speak to that?
Can you repeat that one more time?
Sure. We purchased a training program from Safe Schools that claims to cover all training for entry level. Is there a way to verify this program meets the requirements?
Okay. My suggestion on that is take a look at the curriculum and then go into part 380 and look at appendix A through F, appendices A through F, and make sure that the curriculum that's outlined in that training that you've got covers all of the theory requirements in those appendices. And if you're looking through it and you've got some questions, you can always reach out to me by email or phone, and we can kind of work through it together and see, and just make sure that it covers everything.
Thanks, Paul.
Okay.
Brian, we got a couple more questions. I don't know if you want to go through the rest of your presentation and take these at the end or answer them now.
Go ahead with the questions.
If we run a limited query, annual query, do we need CDL number, date of birth, etc.? What info do we need to run this limited query?
Yes, you'd need the driver's name, date of birth, driver's license number, because all that has to match up.
Okay. And then can schools do the entry-level training themselves? So that would be for Paul.
Yes. A school district could do both the theory and the entry-level training themselves. You would, like, if you chose to do the theory training, let's say online, you would need to make sure that whoever is presenting that that material, one of the first things that you're going to need to make sure of is that it was put together and that it's being instructed by a person that is qualified, meaning that they've got the appropriate CDL with the appropriate endorsements, and that they've got at least 2 years worth of experience, and they could teach that. Then when it comes to the behind the wheel and the behind the wheel training, you would need to make sure that those individuals have, again, 2 years worth of experience, have the proper type of license, and then you would need to make sure that you have access to adequate range facilities where you could do some of those backing maneuvers and make sure that the person is able to control that vehicle and operate it safely, and then be able to document that they've met all the requirements. And you would need to get go through the registry and get register yourself as a training provider and be issued a training registry number.
Okay, that's the questions I have at this time.
Okay, so move on to reporting violations. What violations get reported to the clearinghouse? And we're going to start violations report. This, if you're going to report something. So what gets reported? Alcohol confirmation test of 0.04 or greater, refusal to test for drugs, actual knowledge of drug or alcohol use, negative return to duty tests, and completion of follow-up testing. That's what's reported in the clearinghouse. So what MROs, you'd report that negative return to duty test, the completion of the following up testing, and also you'd be reporting any refusals where the testing process hasn't begun yet. So you're going to report a refusal if you tell a driver to go for a random test and he doesn't show up. That would be on the employer to report. Now, MROs, they report the positive tests. Refusals, once the process has been started, they go to the testing site and for whatever reason it doesn't get completed. And changes to a verified drug test. If for some reason they change the test to get other information, maybe it's a prescription drug or something, they can change that. They'd report that as well. SAPs, they report the initial assessment and that the driver is eligible for return to duty tests. So as far as that question a couple minutes ago regarding driver information, so you're going to report violations into the system. This is the same as for doing the queries. So it's the driver's name, first name and last name, the date of birth, the driver's license, and the country and state of issuance of that driver's license is the information that you need for each driver to conduct a query or report information. When you enter this information, you've got 2 attempts to get it correct. Otherwise, it'll kick you out and you have to start over again. And this is an example of the screen. You're going to report something. You got alcohol violations, concentrations of 0.4 or greater, refusal to take an alcohol test, actual knowledge of alcohol violation, drug violations, refusal to take a drug test, actual knowledge of a drug violation. This example here, they clicked the refusal to take an alcohol test and failed to remain at testing site was the reason that they gave on that one. Once that information gets entered, it goes to a screen where you're going to verify that information, make sure that everything you've entered is correct. And then there's going to be a little checkbox there where you certify that information that you're reporting to the clearinghouse is accurate and complete. You understand that reporting false information could lead to civil or criminal penalties. You check that box and you submit the violation, and then it goes into the clearinghouse under that driver's file, basically. Frequently asked questions, what violations that occurred prior to January 6, 2020 will be reported in the clearinghouse? None. Only violations that occurred January 6th or later are reported. How long is the information in the clearinghouse maintained? That information is going to be maintained for 5 years or until the return to duty process has been successfully completed, whichever is later. So if you got a driver, he completed the return to duty process, that information is in there for 5 years. If you got a driver who tests positive, he doesn't go see the SAP, he doesn't start the process or do anything, that information is going to be in there basically forever. If he tries to return to the driving, say 10 years down the road, you do a search, it's going to show that he's a positive driver. He's going to have to start the process at that point. Can an employer enter a drug and alcohol program violation if the driver is not registered in the clearinghouse? Yes. Even if a driver is not registered, violation information can be entered in the clearinghouse. Drivers can challenge the accuracy in the information. They cannot challenge the results of a drug test. And a driver can go in through the FMCSA data queue system to challenge inaccurate information. Okay. This is the information. So the clearinghouse has been up and operating since January 6th. And this is the information that's in there so far. And this is as the 1st of October. Total violations reported in the system were 40,433 violations. It seems to be increasing probably on an average of 5,000 per month. You can see that follow-up testing, 842, post-accident testing, 1,700, pre-employments, I think that was the winner of 20,000, almost 21,000 tested positive on pre-employments. Randoms, there was 14,000 positive drivers or refusals, reasonable suspicion 857, and return to duty 473. Positive drug tests accounted for 82% of the total violations reported. The substances identified, you'll see the winner there, of course, is marijuana at 21,000. Followed in second place by cocaine at almost 6,000 violations, and then amphetamine and methamphetamine at 3,800 for methamphetamine, 3,600 for amphetamine. There's just kind of a graph of the same information. And again, if a driver tests positive, the driver must be removed from safety sensitive functions, including operation of commercial motor vehicle, until he or she has completed the return to duty process. He has to go see a SAP, complete that process, be eligible for a return to duty test, and then have that negative return to duty test. Return to duty process, kind of the sad thing, 37,000 drivers have tested positive. And the reason the drug tests are more than this is some of them have multiple drugs in their system. But 34,000 are still in the prohibited status. Only 3,400 have started that return to duty process and can drive right now. Some good information can be found at clearinghouse.fmcsa.dot.gov at Learn. There's some really good resources here, employer resources, driver resources, and it's pretty easy to use with some good information. Also, this full presentation can be found on there. It's about an hour and a half long. There's a recorded webinar of this presentation on there as well. So visit clearinghouse.fmcsa.gov. And again, this is where you go to register, and this is where you're going to go to log in and conduct your queries. This is where drivers would register. And also, again, that information is available there under Learns, and that's a tab right at the top. Or you can contact the Clearinghouse directly at clearinghouse.dot.gov. Same phone number, 701-250-4346. If you have any questions of us, you can contact us at our office here. That ends my presentation. Is there any questions?
I'm not seeing any at this time.
One thing you had mentioned, Rebecca, was the training for supervisors for reasonable suspicion, and I didn't have a slide on this, but make sure you have at least one person in your district that is trained for reasonable suspicion training. So if a driver comes in, he's not acting quite right, that they can document and send that driver in for reasonable suspicion training. Reasonable suspicion training can be found in 382.603 of the regulations, and it requires 60 minutes for drugs, 60 minutes for alcohol. And once your employees have completed this, or at least one employee, it's good. There's no recurring training on it. One time is good. And I recommend having at least a couple people that have direct contact with drivers having this training, so they can identify drivers that might be under the influence of drugs or alcohol and send them in for testing.
Okay, I'm seeing no other questions. So
Okay.
Thank you, Brian and Paul. This
Thank
ends
you.
this ends our training today. Remember that this webinar recording, the slides, and associated resources will be available at www.ndsba.org under resources. Our next Lunch and Learn is set for December 16th at noon. We'll be talking about the do's and don'ts of social media usage by school board members. If you would like to take part in this session, remember to register if you have not already. Registration information for upcoming NDSBA Lunch and Learns can be found on the NDSBA website under the Resource tab. If you did find this information useful, please let your fellow education leaders know so that they can watch and possibly join us next time. Thank you again to our sponsor, Construction Engineers, and for all of you for joining us today. We truly appreciate your participation. Contact our office at 1-800-932-8791 if you have questions on any of the information you heard today. We look forward to seeing you next month. Stay safe, stay healthy, and all the best, guys.